Hello and welcome to the next lesson in this free Hyper-V training course for Windows Server 2012 and Windows Server 2012 R2. So far in this training course, I have demonstrated how to install the Hyper-V role onto a Windows Server 2012 or Windows Server 2012 R2 server. I then showed you how to create a virtual machine. And finally, in the last lesson, I demonstrated how to install an operating system onto a virtual machine. Now that our virtual machine is up and running and has an operating system installed, the next topic to cover is guest integration services. Since there is a lot to guest integration services, I will split this topic into two separate lessons. In this first lesson, I will provide an overview of guest integration services, including what it is and how it works. Next, I will look at which Windows operating systems are capable of running guest integration services. And finally, I will demonstrate how to install guest integration services onto a virtual machine on my Windows Server 2012 R2 Hyper-V host. The first question you probably have is, what is guest integration services? Guest integration services is essentially an add-on package that can be installed onto Hyper-V virtual machines. That is, after you have created your virtual machine and installed your guest operating system, you then have the option to install guest integration services. Guest integration services is essentially a software package which is made up of services and drivers. The purpose of guest integration services is to improve communication between the Hyper-V host and virtual machines. Furthermore, guest integration services adds new functionality to virtual machines to make them easier to manage and administer. When you install guest integration services onto a Hyper-V virtual machine, you are essentially installing additional services onto that virtual machine. These new services, just like all other services, will run seamlessly in the background on the virtual machine. If you are using Windows Server 2012 as your Hyper-V host, the Guest Integration Services package is version 6.2 and will add a total of 6 services to every virtual machine it is installed on. These are the Hyper-V Data Exchange Service, the Hyper-V Guest Shutdown Service, the Hyper-V Heartbeat Service, the Hyper-V Remote Desktop Virtualization Service, the Hyper-V Time Synchronization Service, and the Hyper-V Volume Shadow Copy Requester. With the release of Windows Server 2012 R2, Microsoft released version 6.3 of Guest Integration Services and increased the number of services to 7 with the addition of the Hyper-V Guest Services Interface. This additional service is only installed onto Hyper-V virtual machines running on a Windows Server 2012 R2 Hyper-V host. Apart from the addition of this service, version 6.2 and version 6.3 of Guest Integration Services are practically identical. Don't worry if you are unsure what these services do right now. For this lesson, all we are concerned with is how to install the services. In the next lesson, I will discuss, in detail, what each of these services do and will demonstrate how they work. Now that we understand the basic concepts of guest integration services, the next topic to discuss is which guest operating systems are actually capable of running guest integration services. The first point I would like to make is that, unfortunately, not all guest operating systems are able to use guest integration services. However, just because an operating system does not support guest integration services does not mean it cannot be used as a virtual machine. It simply means that that operating system cannot use the services provided by guest integration services. With Windows Server 2012 and Windows Server 2012 R2 Hyper-V hosts, you can install guest integration services onto a range of Windows Server and Windows Client operating systems. Fortunately, some Windows operating systems already come with the latest versions of guest integration services built in. That is, when you install one of these newer operating systems onto a Hyper-V virtual machine, guest integration services will be installed along with it. However, if you are planning to install an older version of Windows onto a virtual machine, the built-in guest integration services may not be the latest versions and will have to be upgraded. Whereas much older versions of Windows come with no guest integration services installed at all and will have to be installed from scratch. On a further note, some Windows operating systems may require the latest service packs before guest integration services can be upgraded or installed. Without further ado, I will now take a look at which operating systems are capable of running guest integration services as virtual machines on a Windows Server 2012 or Windows Server 2012 R2 Hyper-V host. Let's say that you have two Hyper-V hosts, one running Windows Server 2012 and the other running Windows Server 2012 R2. Next, you create a virtual machine on both hosts. You now need to install an operating system onto those virtual machines and, optionally, install guest integration services. I will now run through each of the guest operating systems one at a time which are capable of running guest integration services and whether or not there are any prerequisites. Remember, the only difference between the two host systems is that Windows Server 2012 uses version 6.2 of guest integration services, and Windows Server 2012 R2 uses version 6.3. The first operating system is Windows Server 2012 R2. At the time of this recording, Windows Server 2012 R2 is the latest Microsoft Server operating system. As such, it comes with the latest guest integration services, version 6.3, already built in. If Windows Server 2012 R2 is deployed as a virtual machine, there is no need to install guest integration services, since they are already installed and are up to date. However, one exception to this rule is if your Hyper-V host is Windows Server 2012. Since Windows Server 2012 Hyper-V hosts only support Guest Integration Services version 6.2, the Windows Server 2012 R2 virtual machine is also forced to use this version and cannot take advantage of the benefits of version 6.3, despite them being built in. The next system is Windows Server 2012. With Windows Server 2012, guest integration services are, once again, pre-installed with the operating system. Windows Server 2012 comes with version 6.2 of guest integration services built in, so there is no need to install the services manually. Of course, if you are using a Windows Server 2012 R2 Hyper-V host, this can be upgraded to version 6.3. Next is Windows Server 2008 R2. Virtual machines running Windows Server 2008 R2 Web, Standard, Enterprise, and Data Center editions do in fact come with a version of guest integration services already built in. However, this is an older and outdated version and should be upgraded to the latest versions offered by the Hyper-V host. If your host system is Windows Server 2012, you can upgrade the integration services straight away to version 6.2. However, hosts running Windows Server 2012 R2 will require Service Pack 1 to be installed on the virtual machine as a prerequisite to upgrading to version 6.3. Next, we have Windows Server 2008. Windows Server 2008 Web, Standard, Enterprise and Data Center editions also have an older version of guest integration services built into the operating system. Therefore, after setting up the virtual machine, you should upgrade these services to the latest versions on offer. However, in order to upgrade guest integration services, you are required to install Service Pack 2 as a prerequisite on both Windows Server 2012 and Windows Server 2012 R2 Hyper-V hosts. Next up is Windows Server 2003 R2. Hyper-V first made its debut with Windows Server 2008. Since Windows Server 2003 R2 was released before this, back in 2005, it comes with no built-in version of guest integration services. Microsoft has made guest integration services backward compatible with Windows Server 2003 R2, providing you are using the Web, Standard, Enterprise or Data Center editions. Of course, since the services are not built in, you will have to install them manually from scratch. You will also have to install Service Pack 2 beforehand on both types of host. The next system to discuss is Windows Server 2003. Like Windows Server 2003 R2, virtual machines running Windows Server 2003 Web, Standard, Enterprise or Data Center Edition, straight out of the box, come with no guest integration services whatsoever, meaning you will have to install them manually. Also like Windows Server 2003 R2, Service Pack 2 is also required as a prerequisite to the installation. You can also install guest integration services onto virtual machines running both Windows Home Server 2011 and Windows Small Business Server 2011 Essentials and Standard Edition. With both of these distributions, there are no built-in guest integration services. You will therefore have to install the services from scratch. That about covers it for the server operating systems that can use guest integration services. So I will now move on and look at the Windows client systems. The first client system to discuss is Windows 8.1. As with Windows Server 2012 R2, Windows 8.1 already comes with the latest guest integration services, version 6.3, built in. Therefore, installing guest integration services onto Windows 8.1 is not necessary. However, once again, since Windows Server 2012 Hyper-V hosts are limited to version 6.2 of guest integration services, virtual machines running Windows 8.1 will also be affected by this limitation. Next, we have Windows 8. Windows 8, straight out of the box, just like Windows Server 2012, comes with version 6.2 of guest integration services built into the operating system. So, once again, no installation of guest integration services is required. However, Windows Server 2012 R2 Hyper-V hosts are able to upgrade this to version 6.3. Next is Windows 7. Virtual machines running Windows 7 Professional, Enterprise or Ultimate editions already have an older version of guest integration services built in. This can, of course, be upgraded to the latest versions offered by the Hyper-V host. If you are using Windows Server 2012 as your Hyper-V host, you can do this immediately. Windows Server 2012 R2 hosts, however, will first require the installation of Service Pack 1. The next system is Windows Vista. Virtual machines utilising Windows Vista Business, Enterprise or Ultimate Edition come with no guest integration services installed whatsoever. Therefore, to use these services, you will have to install them manually. To do this, however, both host systems will require the installation of Service Pack 2 as a prerequisite. Finally, we have Windows XP. Windows XP comes without any guest integration services installed. Providing you are using the Professional edition of the operating system, these can be installed manually. Once again, both host systems will require the installation of Service Pack 2 beforehand. Now that we know which operating systems support guest integration services, I will now change over to my Windows Server 2012 R2 Hyper-V server to demonstrate how to install guest integration services onto a Windows virtual machine. First, open Server Manager from the bottom left corner and select Tools from the top right corner. From the drop-down list, select Hyper-V Manager. This will open the Hyper-V Manager console. From the list of virtual machines, notice that I have created 3 virtual machines, named vServer 1, vServer 2, and vServer 3. My vServer 1 virtual machine contains a clean installation of Windows Server 2012 R2. My vServer 2 virtual machine contains a fresh install of Windows Server 2012 and is running in server core mode. And lastly, my vServer 3 virtual machine is running a clean installation of Windows Server 2003. Apart from installing the operating systems, I have made no further changes to any of these virtual machines. As you can see, all of these virtual machines are in the running state, which essentially means they are powered on. In a moment, I will show you how to install guest integration services onto all of these virtual machines. If you recall from earlier, I mentioned that Windows Server 2012 R2 comes with the latest guest integration services built in. As such, there is no need to install guest integration services onto my vServer 1 virtual machine, since they should already be present. To prove that this is the case, I will attempt to install the services anyway. If I double-click on my vServer 1 virtual machine, the console for the virtual machine will open, and I will be presented with the traditional Windows Server 2012 R2 login screen. Notice that I am being asked to press Ctrl-Alt-Delete to log on. However, with virtual machines in Hyper-V, you should refrain from pressing the Ctrl-Alt-Delete key combination on your keyboard, even if you are prompted. If I were to press Ctrl-Alt-Delete on my keyboard, this will not unlock the virtual machine. Instead, it will lock the Hyper-V host machine. To send the Ctrl-Alt-Delete keystroke to a virtual machine, Microsoft provides you with a special button in the top left corner of the virtual machine window. The button has a symbol on it which looks like a set of keyboard keys. If I press this button, the keystroke will be sent to the virtual machine. I am then able to interact with the virtual machine window and log in to the computer. Remember, a virtual machine is a completely separate computer in its own right. Virtual machines, just like regular computers, have their own built-in local user accounts which can be used to log in. After logging in, we are presented with a standard Windows Server 2012 R2 desktop. Installing guest integration services onto a virtual machine is simply a matter of clicking Action and selecting Insert Integration Services Setup Disk from the drop-down list. The act of doing this will insert a special ISO image into the virtual machine's virtual DVD drive. If I open File Explorer on this virtual server, notice that Windows is detecting an Integration Services Setup disk in the virtual DVD drive. If I double-click the Integration Services Setup disk, Notice, on this occasion, I am receiving an information prompt stating that this computer is already running the current version of integration services and even gives the version number of 6.3. This proves that guest integration services are already installed and are up to date on this virtual machine. If you recall from earlier, I mentioned that guest integration services are services, just like any other, which run in the background on the computer. To show you these services, I will open a Run prompt from the Start button and will launch the Services console. Notice from the list of services that there are several Hyper-V services listed. These services are the Hyper-V guest integration services, which were installed as part of the operating system. These services can be started, stopped, paused and resumed just like any other service. Don't worry about what these services do right now. I will cover these services in a lot more detail in the next lesson. I will now close the Services console, lock my vServer 1 virtual machine, and close the virtual machine window. As you can see, Guest Integration Services is relatively straightforward to install on a virtual machine running a full graphical user interface. However, it is also possible to install the services onto a virtual machine running in Server Core mode. Server Core was first introduced with Windows Server 2008 and allows you to install Windows Server operating systems without a GUI. When this is the case, the server is administered entirely from the command line or through Windows PowerShell. To demonstrate how to install guest integration services in Server Core, I will use my vServer 2 virtual machine, which is running Windows Server 2012 in Server Core mode. So I will open the virtual machine and log in. As you can see, this virtual machine has no user interface whatsoever. In fact, all we have is a command prompt. To install guest integration services onto a virtual machine running in Server Core, first click Action and select Insert Integration Services Setup Disk from the drop-down list. However, in order to run the integration services, you need to know the drive letter of the virtual DVD drive assigned to this virtual machine. To figure this out, run the command WMIC logical disk get device ID, volume name, description. This will list all of the drives connected to this virtual machine. As you can see, this virtual machine has a 3.5-inch floppy drive using drive letter A, a local disk using drive letter C, and a CD-ROM drive using drive letter D. Now that I know the drive letter for my virtual CD-ROM drive, I will run the command d:/support /x86 /setup.exe. After a short wait, I will receive a prompt stating that there are integration services already installed on this virtual machine, but these can be upgraded if I wish. To do this, click the OK button. Now that the services have been upgraded, I will be instructed to reboot my virtual machine. When the reboot completes, the services will have been upgraded to the latest version. So I will now close the virtual machine. The last virtual machine I have is my vServer 3 virtual machine. If you recall from earlier, I mentioned that guest integration services are not installed on older versions of Windows by default. In other words, on some Windows versions, they have to be installed manually. Since my vServer 3 virtual machine is running a clean installation of Windows Server 2003, guest integration services will not be included straight out of the box. To prove this, I will double-click my vServer 3 virtual machine to launch the virtual machine window and will log in to the local machine. From the desktop, I will click Start, point to Administrative Tools, and will open Services. If I scroll down through the list of services, notice that there are no Hyper-V services included by default. Therefore, if I want to use guest integration services on this virtual machine, I will have to install them manually. Also note that if I attempt to move my mouse cursor out of the virtual machine window, this will not work. In other words, the cursor is essentially trapped within the virtual machine window. However, if guest integration services were installed, the mouse cursor would no longer be stuck in the virtual environment and will move seamlessly between the Hyper-V host and the virtual machine. To release the mouse cursor, you are forced to enter the Control, Alt, and left arrow key combination, which can be rather inconvenient. Before I attempt to install guest integration services, I would like to prove one final point. If you recall from earlier, I mentioned that certain versions of Windows require the latest available service packs before guest integration services can be installed. In the case of Windows Server 2003, you may recall that Service Pack 2 is required. If I click Start, Run, and enter the command winver, this will launch the About Windows dialog box. From here, I can see that this is, indeed, a copy of Windows Server 2003. However, there are no service packs installed. If any service packs were installed, they would be listed here. Nevertheless, I will close the About Windows dialog box, will release my mouse cursor from the virtual machine window, and will attempt to insert the Guest Integration Services setup disk. At this point, notice that I am receiving an error message, informing me that I must upgrade this server to Service Pack 2 before Guest Integration Services can be installed. I will accept the prompt by clicking the OK button. Since I knew this would happen, I have placed the Service Pack 2 installer on the desktop of this virtual machine. So I will launch the executable and will install Service Pack 2. I have now finished installing Service Pack 2. As such, I will now re-attempt to insert my Guest Integration Services setup disk. Notice now that Windows will immediately start to install Guest Integration Services onto this virtual machine. This can take a number of minutes to complete. After installing the services, Windows will prompt you to reboot the virtual machine. To complete the installation, I will accept this and perform the reboot. Following a reboot of my vServer 3 virtual machine, you will notice a few differences. First, you will see that I am now able to move my mouse cursor in and out of the virtual machine window without any issues. This is a good indication that the Guest Integration Services drivers have been successfully installed. Next, I will open the Services console from the Start menu. If I scroll down through the list of services, notice that several Hyper-V services have now appeared, indicating that Guest Integration Services are now installed on this virtual machine. This concludes this lesson on how to install Guest Integration Services onto a Hyper-V virtual machine. I hope you have enjoyed this lesson and found it useful. In the next lesson, I will look at the individual services that make up the Guest Integration Services package in more detail and will demonstrate how they work. For more Windows Server 2012 or Windows Server 2012 R2 training, check out the videos on our YouTube channel. And don't forget to show your support for our videos by subscribing and by liking our videos. Many thanks, and we'll see you on the next lesson.